At my dad's funeral, while I was standing beside his coffin trying not to fall apart, my husband barked across the room, "Get home now or I'll drag you back myself." The words sliced through the quiet like a blade. Every head turned. My heart stopped. The pastor froze mid-sentence, my mother gasped, and I swear even the air felt ashamed. That's when I realized I wasn't just mourning one death, I was mourning two. I stood there, clutching the edge of the casket so tightly my knuckles turned white. My father's face looked peaceful, and I wondered if he knew this moment would come. Mark's footsteps echoed across the floor as he stormed toward me, jaw tight, eyes burning with that familiar fury he always kept just beneath the surface. "You've been gone long enough," he hissed, gripping my arm hard enough to make me flinch. "You belong at home, not here pretending to care." Gasps rippled through the mourners. My brother took a step forward, fists clenched, but I stopped him with a shake of my head. I couldn't bear to make a scene at my father's final goodbye. Mark leaned closer, his breath hot and venomous against my ear. "Don't test me, Lena," he whispered. "You know what happens when you embarrass me." The words hit harder than his grip. I swallowed my shame and forced my voice to stay steady. "Please, not here," I whispered back. But he smirked, knowing he'd won, and walked away as if he hadn't just shattered the last ounce of dignity I had left. Everyone avoided my eyes after that. My mother dabbed her tears but never looked up. My brother muttered something under his breath about "that bastard," and the pastor tried to continue, his voice trembling. I just stared at my father's coffin, hearing his voice in my head. "Men who try to control you will one day destroy you if you let them." Tears blurred my vision as I whispered so softly no one else could hear, "You warned me, Dad. You always knew." And for the first time in years I felt something shift inside me, something small, fragile but alive. I still remember the night I met Mark. It was at a charity gala downtown, the kind where everyone sipped champagne and pretended to care about causes they'd already forgotten by morning. He was magnetic, confident, funny, the kind of man who made you feel like you were the only person in the room. When he asked me to dance, I said yes without hesitation. He moved with a quiet assurance that made me feel safe, seen, even special. Within months we were inseparable. Our relationship burned fast and bright. He'd send flowers to my office, leave notes on my windshield, and tell me I was the calm he never knew he needed. I thought I'd found forever. My dad, Arthur, had looked skeptical at first, but I brushed it off. When Mark proposed under twinkling lights at the same gala a year later, I said yes through tears, certain this was what love was supposed to feel like. But something shifted after the wedding. His charm didn't disappear. It just changed direction. The compliments became corrections. The concern turned into control. "That dress is a little much," he'd say, or "Why do you still talk to your coworkers after hours?" It was subtle at first, disguised as care. I told myself he just loved me too much. Then came the smaller rules. Which friends I could keep, which colors looked respectable, how long I should spend at the gym. I started to shrink myself to fit the space he allowed. When I tried to push back, he'd tilt his head and say, "You're being ungrateful. Do you even realize how lucky you are?" One night at dinner with friends, I laughed a little too loudly at a joke someone made. Mark's smile froze and the room went quiet. He looked right at me and said, "You really are too emotional sometimes, Lena. It's embarrassing." The table fell silent. I wanted to disappear. On the drive home I stayed quiet, hoping he'd apologize. He didn't. Later that week my dad stopped by. He didn't ask questions, just looked at me for a long moment before saying softly, "Men who need to shrink you aren't partners, they're prisons." I smiled weakly, pretending not to understand. But deep down I knew exactly what he meant. The ride home after the funeral felt endless. Mark's silence wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, simmering just beneath the surface. His knuckles were white against the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the road like he was trying to outrun what had happened. I stared out the window, still in my black dress, my father's voice echoing in my head. Every mile felt heavier than the last. When we pulled into the driveway, he finally spoke. "You made me look like a fool in there," he snapped. I turned to him, stunned. "Mark, I didn't do anything. You yelled at me at a funeral." His head whipped toward me. "Don't twist this around," he barked. "You stood there like some victim, letting everyone pity you. You embarrassed me in front of your entire family." I couldn't find the strength to argue. The exhaustion, the grief, the humiliation, it all sat in my chest like a stone. I just wanted to say goodbye to my dad, I said quietly. That only made him angrier. He slammed his hand against the dashboard. Your father never respected me anyway. He poisoned you against me from the start. The words hung in the air, cold and cruel. I stepped out of the car before he could say more and walked straight into the house. It felt different without my father. Quieter, emptier, like even the walls missed him. I went to his study, the one place Mark never bothered to enter. The faint smell of old books and pipe tobacco lingered. I sank into my father's chair, tracing the grain of the desk with trembling fingers. That's when I noticed it, an envelope tucked beneath a framed photo of us fishing at the lake. My name was written in his neat, deliberate handwriting. Lena. My heart thudded as I opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded once. His words were simple but heavy. Don't waste your life on people who mistake cruelty for strength. Tears blurred the ink as I read it over and over. It wasn't just a letter. It was a message he somehow knew I'd need. The house creaked in the silence, and for the first time that night I didn't feel broken. I felt warned. I felt seen. And deep inside something in me began to shift. The week after the funeral passed in a blur of condolences and silence. Mark acted as if nothing had happened, but the tension hung heavy between us. I kept my head down, answering when spoken to, pretending to agree with everything he said. Inside, though, my thoughts were elsewhere, on my father's words, on that letter I'd read until the paper began to tear at the creases. When the lawyer called to go over the will, Mark insisted on joining, but I told him I needed to handle it alone. It's just paperwork, I said lightly. He hesitated, then agreed, though his eyes lingered on me too long. At the office, the lawyer handed me a folder with my name embossed in gold. Inside were documents, accounts I didn't recognize, and a deed to a lakeside cabin in Vermont. My father's cabin. I hadn't seen it since I was a child, but I remembered the smell of pine, the sound of water lapping against the dock, the feeling of freedom. The inheritance wasn't large, but it was enough. Enough to start over. Enough to disappear. I thanked the lawyer, slipped the papers into my bag, and drove home feeling something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. That night, after Mark went to bed, I took out the documents and read through every line. I hid them beneath the lining of an old suitcase he never used. Then I tucked my father's letter into a book on the highest shelf of the closet. For the first time, my secret life began to take shape. But Mark's instincts were sharp when it came to control. He started checking my phone, asking why grocery runs took too long, questioning who I spoke to. Once, when I came home from visiting my mother, he blocked the doorway and said, "You don't need her filling your head with nonsense." His tone wasn't loud, but it was final. So I adjusted. I smiled more, nodded often, cooked his favorite meals, laughed at the right moments. To anyone watching, I looked like the perfect wife again. Inside, I was counting the days. Each smile was a mask, each yes, a step closer to the door. He thought I was his shadow. He didn't realize I was already gone in every way that mattered. I found Eli's number buried in an old contact list my father once gave me. My hands trembled as I dialed, half afraid he wouldn't remember me. But when he answered, his voice carried the same calm steadiness I remembered from childhood. "Lena Marlowe," he said after a pause. "I haven't heard that name in years." I smiled despite the ache in my chest. We talked about my father, about the cabin, about the summers we spent chasing fireflies and fixing the old boat. I asked if the place was still there. He said it was, though the roof needed work and the dock had seen better days. Then quietly he added, "If you ever want to see it again, I can help fix it up." I hesitated, glancing toward the hallway where Mark was pacing in the other room. "Maybe," I said. "Someday." We began exchanging short calls, always during my lunch breaks, always when Mark couldn't trace them. Eli never pried, but I could hear the concern in his voice. One afternoon, when we met briefly near his garage to hand off some old cabin papers, he noticed the faint bruise circling my wrist. His eyes darkened, but he didn't ask. He just said softly, "You don't have to keep pretending." That quiet understanding stayed with me long after I drove away. Mark's suspicion grew sharper by the day. He'd show up outside my office waiting in the car, pretending it was coincidence. Once, when a male coworker complimented my report, Mark showed up that evening asking whose attention I was seeking. I learned to move carefully, to make every answer sound small and harmless. But the walls were closing in, and he could sense the distance between us widening. One night at dinner his tone turned cold. "I know you're hiding something," he said, his fork clicking against the plate. I met his eyes, steady this time. "I'm just tired of being afraid," I whispered. He leaned forward, his face twisting. "What did you just say?" My voice didn't shake. "You don't own me." The slap came fast, sharp, echoing through the kitchen. I didn't move. I didn't cry. I just stared at him, something inside me hardening into quiet steel. For the first time he looked uncertain, like he'd felt the ground shift beneath him and didn't yet understand that he'd already lost control. When Mark announced he'd be leaving for a 3-day business trip, I nodded, pretending it was just another routine week. I kissed him goodbye at the door, smiled like I meant it, and watched his car disappear down the street. The moment the taillights vanished, I let out the breath I'd been holding for years. I moved quickly. Every step had already been mapped out in my mind. I packed only what mattered: documents, my father's letter, a few clothes, the small envelope of money I'd hidden in a flour tin. I slipped off my wedding ring and left it on the kitchen counter, right beside the half-empty coffee mug he'd forgotten that morning. The silence of the house felt different now. Not heavy, just empty. In the garage, my father's old truck sat under a thin layer of dust. Mark had always called it junk, said he'd sell it someday. But he never did. I ran my hand over the steering wheel, whispering a quiet thank you before turning the key. The engine sputtered, then roared to life. It felt like freedom. I didn't look back when I pulled out of the driveway. The road stretched ahead like an open wound waiting to heal. Street lights blurred past as I drove through the night, the hum of the tires mixing with the sound of my heartbeat. For the first time in years I wasn't scared. I was moving toward something, peace maybe, or just myself. Halfway to Vermont, my phone lit up with Mark's name. The first call I ignored. Then another. And another. Dozens of them, each more frantic than the last. Texts followed, angry, pleading, threatening. "Where are you? Don't do this. You'll regret it." I stared at the screen, my hands shaking, then powered the phone off and dropped it on the passenger seat. The silence that followed was the sweetest sound I'd ever heard. The world outside was dark, but the stars were clear, scattered across the sky like promises I finally believed again. The farther I drove, the lighter I felt. Mile after mile, the weight lifted, and the voice that had controlled me for so long began to fade. By dawn, all that was left was the road, the truck, and the quiet certainty that I was never going back. By the time I reached the cabin, the morning light was just breaking through the trees. The old place looked smaller than I remembered, the paint chipped and the porch sagging, but it was still standing, still waiting. I stepped out of the truck, the air crisp and quiet, and for a long moment I just breathed. No shouting. No footsteps behind me. Just wind and birdsong. Inside, everything was coated in dust, like the world had paused here years ago. The faint smell of cedar lingered, mingling with the memories. I ran my fingers along the windowsill, remembering summers with my dad, his laughter echoing as we fixed the roof, his steady voice teaching me how to start the old generator. For the first time in a long while, I felt safe enough to cry. A few days later, Eli showed up with a toolbox and that same patient smile. "You weren't kidding, it needs work," he said, stepping onto the creaking porch. Together we cleaned, hammered, patched, and painted. The days blended into a rhythm of quiet repairs and easy conversation. He'd tell stories about my father, how he'd never accept help but always offered it to everyone else. I listened, soaking in every word, rebuilding more than just walls. At night, I'd sit by the fireplace, sorting through legal papers with my father's lawyer on speakerphone. He was discreet, professional, and calm, promising to handle the divorce quietly. Each signature felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that Mark had taken. When I mailed the final packet, my hands didn't tremble. The messages started soon after, voicemails filled with everything from fake apologies to vicious threats. "You can't just leave me," he snarled in one. "You think you'll survive without me?" In another, his tone softened, almost pleading. "Please, Lena. I can change." I deleted everyone. Eli never asked about the calls, but sometimes I'd catch him glancing toward my phone when it buzzed. He didn't push, just tightened a screw, handed me another nail, and kept working beside me. The silence between us was steady, unspoken, kind. By the time we finished repairing the front steps, the cabin didn't look perfect, but neither did I. It was stronger, weathered, and still standing. That was enough. For the first time in years, I could finally sleep without locking the door. It happened on a gray afternoon, months after the cabin had finally begun to feel like home again. I was fixing a loose shutter when I heard tires crunching on the gravel road. The sound made my stomach twist before I even saw the car. Then he stepped out, Mark. His suit was wrinkled, his face harder, eyes wild with something that looked more like desperation than anger. "Lena," he called, voice booming through the trees. "You can't hide from me forever." My pulse quickened, but I stayed still. Eli's truck was parked nearby. He was inside working on the fireplace. I knew he'd hear him soon enough. Mark stalked up the porch steps, pointing toward me. "You've made your point. Now get your things, we're going home." His tone was command, not request, the same voice that used to make me shrink. But it didn't work anymore. I kept my hand on the doorframe, steady. "I'm not going anywhere." He laughed, a harsh, empty sound. "You think you can just walk away from your husband? From everything I gave you?" He stepped closer, his breath sharp, his hand twitching near my arm. "You belong with me." Before he could touch me, Eli appeared in the doorway behind me, calm but solid, his presence cutting through the tension. "You need to leave," he said evenly. Mark turned on him, jaw tight. "Stay out of this. It's between me and my wife." "She's not your wife anymore," Eli replied, taking a step forward. The air thickened. Mark's face flushed red. He shouted, spit flying, tossing out threats about lawyers, property, revenge. I didn't move. For once I wasn't afraid. I met his eyes and said quietly but clearly, "You humiliated me at my father's funeral. That was the last time you'll ever raise your voice at me." He froze, the words landing harder than any slap. Eli pulled out his phone and called the police. Mark kept pacing, muttering, until the flashing lights appeared through the trees. When the officers arrived, he tried to argue, but they escorted him away, his shouts fading down the road. When it was over, I stood on the porch, the world finally still. Eli asked if I was okay. I nodded, though my hands were shaking. For the first time, the fear was gone. It wasn't hiding, it was finished. The papers came in a thick envelope, stamped and sealed. I opened them slowly at the cabin's kitchen table, the one I'd refinished with Eli's help months earlier. Inside were the final divorce documents. Official, cold, but freeing. My name stood alone again. No hyphen. No attachment. Just me. I signed where the lawyer had marked with yellow tabs, the sound of the pen scratching across the paper like a door closing quietly. It wasn't triumph I felt, it was release. I'd spent years living in someone else's shadow, someone else's control. Now there was nothing left to bind me. A week later I heard from the lawyer again. Mark's license had been suspended. One of his clients had filed a report after he lost his temper during a showing. The board investigated and everything unraveled. For the first time, it wasn't my fault. It wasn't my burden to carry. That evening I drove to the lake. The water was calm, still reflecting the last blush of sunset. I carried a small wooden box in my hands. My father's ashes. The letter he'd written was folded inside, edges worn soft from how many times I'd read it. I knelt by the edge, opened the box, and let the ashes scatter into the wind. The breeze caught them, carried them across the water, and I whispered, "I'm living differently now, Dad. Just like you wanted." Behind me, Eli stood a few feet away, quiet as ever. He didn't say a word, just watched the lake with me. His presence was steady, never demanding. He didn't fill the silence, he respected it. When the last bit of light faded, I rose and brushed my hands clean. Tomorrow I'd start at the town's small clinic, helping people rebuild what life had broken. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest. As I walked back to the cabin, the night air cool against my skin, I realized something simple yet powerful. I hadn't just survived. I'd started over. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The sky was streaked in pale gold when I stepped onto the porch, mug warm between my hands. The air carried the smell of pine and dew, quiet, unbroken, alive. For months, mornings like this had become my ritual. No shouting, no fear. Just stillness. The cabin had changed with me. Curtains replaced, floors mended, a new life tucked between old walls. I didn't count the days anymore. I just lived them. Eli's truck rumbled up the gravel path, breaking the silence gently. He climbed out, toolbox in hand, and gave me that familiar half-smile. "So, you ready to build the dock?" he asked. I didn't hesitate. "Yeah," I said, smiling back, and this time it felt real, deep in my chest. We walked together toward the water. The lake shimmered beneath the rising sun, soft ripples catching light like scattered glass. I paused at the edge, letting the calm wrap around me. "Dad," I whispered in my thoughts, "I finally came home. Do you think I made the right choice by walking away from that marriage, or should I have tried one last time? Tell me in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine.